I remember walking onto a university campus where I read a sign on the marquee that read, "This university promotes truth, justice, and tolerance." And I remember thinking to myself at the time, I believe only two of these are even going to be possible. For example, take justice, for example. Suppose a woman was raped by a rapist and they caught the guy. And now the woman and the rapist are both sitting in the courtroom in front of a judge. And the judge looks over at the woman and says, you know, ma'am, I realize that you've been raped and victimized here, but, you know, we just have to tolerate these things. I mean, we've been writing laws and legislation for hundreds of years to prevent this sort of thing, but, you know, we're a society that just needs to be tolerant. And sometimes, you know, things like this happen, you know, so we just need to tolerate these sort of things. See, at that point, what happened was justice was violated at the altar of tolerance. So justice has been undermined, and tolerance has been elevated. Postmodern relativism as a philosophy on life is just absolutely silly when you think about it. For example, let's suppose somebody came up to you after the Super Bowl 48, and said, well, to me, the Denver Broncos won the Super Bowl, and, you know, that's my truth. To you, the Seattle Seahawks won, and that may be true for you, but not for me. Just absolutely silliness. Or let's suppose, for example, that this same person who claims to be a postmodern relativist when it comes to things like the Super Bowl in this analogy, it's going to be a very different story when, say, they go through some type of crisis. For example, let's say somebody close to them, like their mother or their father, passed away, and you say, well, you know, to me, your father's still alive, and, you know, I'm going to have lunch with him next week. You know, to you, he passed away and he died, but to me, you know, he's still alive. And I'm going to have lunch with him next week. So you should probably just get over whatever you're going through, and you know, this kind of thing. Just absolute nonsense, right? Nobody, and it's amazing to me how a philosophy like this even gets off the ground. But so many young people buy into these postmodern relativistic concepts of philosophy, and it just reminds me of a culture that just really doesn't really think very well. They don't really use their mind very well when it comes to really thinking about philosophical issues and philosophical laws. Take, for example, the law of non-contradiction, for example. One cannot be both one thing and another thing at the same time in the same setting. For example, it cannot both be raining outside and not raining outside at the same time in the same place in the same context. Which really gets to the issue of truth. What is true? Truth as a category does exist. In Greek, we call it veritas, or veritology, the study of truth, its nature, its presuppositions, and its foundations. For example, truth as is defined as that which corresponds to reality, fact, or actuality. And certain things are just true by definition. For example, if I say to you that all bachelors are unmarried men, well, that's absolutely true. Which brings me to another philosophical law, the law of excluded middle, which would go something like this in a sentence. She is pregnant or she's not pregnant, and it excludes any other options being possible. So if you happen to be talking to somebody who claims to be a postmodern relativist, and just the silliness of that philosophy, be sure to challenge them respectfully, but be sure to challenge them on just such silly thinking, and correct their thinking and saying, you know, this way that you're interpreting the world around you is not really going to work. It's not going to work philosophically, and it's not going to correspond to reality. Happiness, as currently defined by our current culture, connotes excitement and or pleasure, or maybe immediate gratification, which, you know, some of those things can be a good thing. They can, but that's not at all how the ancient teachers defined what true happiness is. What they taught about happiness was a person that was truly a person of true happiness would be a person that had wisdom and was virtuous and was noble and courageous. This would be a person that was considered happy. If we take the current culture's definition of what happiness is, and I live my life that way, what that would mean is I would be a person that is kind of self-absorbed and kind of self-centered, and I'm kind of self-focused because I live my life based upon what's going to give me immediate gratification, what's going to give me pleasure and excitement. Not that those things necessarily are a bad thing per se, but we need to ask ourselves, what is a legitimate pleasure? And after we answer that question, we can then follow it up and say, well, what is moral gratification, and what does that look like? And once we answer that question, then we can kind of start to unpack this thing and say, wait a minute, for me to have a thick or thin, as we philosophers say, we call it thick and thin worldviews. A thin worldview would be shallow. A thick, robust worldview would be something that is on the level of something that is true and authentic. So again, happiness, how are you going to live your life based upon what definition of happiness? Are you going to go with the culture, the current culture's definition of happiness, what we philosophers call a thin worldview? Or are you going to live your life based upon a robust, thick definition of what happiness is?